To use or not to use a podium? A lot of people ask me this question. Should you use a podium? Because they see me often not using a podium, and today I'm going to tell you exactly when you should use a podium and when you should not use a podium, and a couple of other thoughts around it. But before we get started, subscribe to my YouTube channel. By doing that, these videos come right to you. In addition, like and comment on the videos. I'll look at what you guys are putting in the comments and I'll interact with you to add value. Take a moment to give helpful suggestions, guys. Share your own stories so that others can also benefit from these things. To a lot of speakers, guys, podiums are the way to go, and this is the only format they ever use. And for others, podiums are a hindrance. It's a disconnect between the audience. And there's a situation where I would even use a podium, a person like myself who often people say, you never use a podium, you're never behind a podium. But guys, there's about 5 reasons why you should use a podium, and here's my first one. When there's a fixed branding on a podium, when you're in front of a camera, and there's a fixed branding on a podium, that's a great time. You should stand behind it. Otherwise, you know, your sponsors might get upset. Another reason is when there's a branding behind you. They're not going to brand the whole stage sometimes. There's just a branding behind you and a lot of news cameras recording you, and there's fixed mics there. Then you have to be behind a podium. If you move around, then you're going to get in a lot of trouble. When you're preaching to an audience, guys, it's sometimes important to use a podium because a podium at that time shows authority. When you're behind a podium, you're speaking to an audience and you've automatically established the fact that, look guys, I'm speaking from a position of power. Then you're going to use a podium, a school principal, maybe a head of a very large company using a podium. But sometimes nowadays they're using what you could call an invisible podium, that there's a one place to stand and there's a fixed mic coming up from the ground. So it still shows that that is the position you're supposed to speak from, but that's the position of power. Another reason to use a podium, guys, is when you're going to have a speech that is far too long and you've not memorized it, it's a good idea to keep that speech on the podium. Whether it's a speech or a laptop that you're flipping through and you're showing people on a bigger screen, you might want to use a podium for those situations. You could very well be walking around with a clicker, but what if you don't have a clicker? It looks a little silly sometimes when you have to keep running back to the podium to switch the slides. I've done it before and then I realized, you know what, I should just be behind this podium. That's worked for me beautifully sometimes. Here's reasons when not to use a podium. I'll use the same example of somebody preaching to a crowd. Let's say we have a head of a company who's going to give a long-winded speech about something and he wants to use a podium because it's an informative speech, or he's trying to discipline people on a certain issue. Well, that's a great way to do it. Stick behind a podium, it shows your power. But what if you're going to give a motivational speech? What if you're going to motivate the whole crowd on a company day or on an annual day? Then you want to get in with them because now you're trying to persuade them. So for a persuasive speech, you want to connect with the audience. You want to be one with them. You want to show them, look, I'm one of you guys. Take the mic around, talk to people. And otherwise, when you're at a podium, you're restricted. You can't do any of that. I often tell people, memorize your speech, memorize your speech. And when is it possible to memorize your speech? Just about every time, according to me. Even with a person like myself who has a tough time memorizing speeches, I memorize even the best of them. And when you do you really want to be behind a podium that people think you're reading from something? Then you walk around, you show your grace, you show your glamour, you show your charisma, because you're in the audience or you're walking around on the stage and it looks pretty good. You don't want to be restricted. And one time I had to give a speech in which there was a lot of branding behind the podium, so I still moved around. I didn't move around all that much, but sometimes I'd be on one side of the podium, sometimes I'd be on the other side of the podium. I'd be interacting with the audiences all over, still keeping my body maybe within a meter of itself, just so that I could show people, guys, I don't want to be restricted behind this. I'm connecting with you guys. And still the cameras were able to catch the branding, and it worked out for the both of us. Another time when you should not use a podium is when everybody else is speaking from the podium. You want to look different. It's always better to stand out. And if you're the last speaker and you're not using a podium, the audiences will love you. They're going to see a welcome change. It's going to look farm fresh to them. And if you're the middle speaker or the first speaker and you don't use a podium, and if everybody else has to, you're going to look all that much better again, because it'll show you had the charisma of walking around where everybody else did it the old way and they stuck behind a podium. So you just looked a little different. Another reason to not use a podium, guys, is when you don't want the audience to drift off. You see, when you're walking around, when you're in the audience and they're turning their heads or they're looking at you, they're not going to get bored. They're not going to feel any monotony, because every time they turn their head even slightly, they get a new lifeline, and it's like you're resetting the clock on how quickly they were going to fall asleep and doze off. Each time you do that, let's say every 5 or 10 seconds, they have to reset their clock and look back at you. You know what that does is that it keeps them alive. Otherwise they'll start to daydream. People daydream all the time. you might be doing it right now. People daydream all the time. You don't want to be speaking after a prepared speech and you realize that nobody was listening because you were looking monotonous. So guys, break the monotony, get out of the podium if you need to. Guys, when a leader talks, they use their whole body to talk. That's a little hard to do behind a podium, isn't it? When you're walking around, you have that much more leverage. And what happens is that you're also appealing to another sense of theirs. Not only are you appealing to somebody's audio sense, you're also appealing to their visual sense. And kinesthetically, people are learning in another way. And in fact, they often say that body language is much more important than your verbal message. It is true, because when you're walking around, you look like a leader, and then what you're saying becomes all that more persuasive. Guys, don't let me sound like I'm trying to persuade you what to do or what not to do. You have to find your own style. I've already told you that for certain types of speeches, it's important to use a podium, and for some speeches, you might not want to use a podium. See what works for you, and if you're not really sure, do engage with us. You can always find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn, and we'd love to tell you about what the right thing to do in the right situation is. And you know what? When you get comfortable, you might want to switch styles. When you get comfortable, you might want to pick a style and then go with it. You'll be glad you did it.